McNamara's Commissars. The Gesell report, written by left-wing racial agitators and now being implemented in our armed forces, is characterized by outraged congressmen as a vicious document deliberately intended to destroy the morale and the role of military men as defenders of the nation and to convert them into stormtroopers to compel civilian support for administration policies. A bill with wide support is now before Congress to prohibit the administration from enforcing recommendations of the Gesell report. The drive to transform American armed forces into a centralized absolutism at the disposal of the reigning politician began in 1943 and continued through the administrations of Truman and Eisenhower, but did not become a conspicuous affront to the intelligence and patriotism of the people until Kennedy came to power. That is a summary of my report on McNamara's Commissars. The full report after a message from my sponsor. In July 1963, Robert S. McNamara, Secretary of Defense, ordered the armed forces to implement recommendations made in the Gesell report. United States Representative Joe Wagner from Louisiana first brought the Gesell report to public attention. On August 7, Mr. Wagner participated with a large group of other representatives in the House in a discussion which reveals some of the outrageous provisions and purposes of the Gesell report, such as more recruiting should be directed toward Negroes to get more into the services and to increase the number of Negro officers. Negroes should be located in jobs throughout the services regardless of their individual preference in order to have a few everywhere and in all positions. Promotion boards should have more Negro officers on them, fewer whites. Special officers should be appointed on every base to handle all complaints made by Negroes, and such complaints should be encouraged. More Negro girls should be brought on bases for social functions and fewer whites. Negro hostesses should be considered rather than whites. The practice of Negroes gravitating to one base service club and whites to another should not be permitted, even though this might be of their own choosing. The armed forces should help break down local segregated housing by leasing homes in white neighborhoods in the name of the government and moving Negroes in. The traditional duty of base commanders and senior officers to run a military establishment and maintain good community relations by staying out of local controversies is misguided and should be stopped. Military personnel must intervene aggressively in racial controversies on the side of administration policy. The efforts of officers to bring about integration should be constantly reviewed and rated. Promotions should be based on their initiative and accomplishments in this field. Military officers are no longer to be rated for professional excellence, devotion to duty, or superior performance. Their careers will depend on their zeal in promoting the President's political objective of enforcing total integration, not just in the armed forces, but on the civilian population. To guarantee zealous and ideologically correct behavior on the part of military commanders, the Gesell report recommends assignment of special complaint officers, whose role is virtually identical with that of political commissars whom communists attached to military commands in the Soviet Union. The Gesell report also provides for an informer system inside each military command, very similar to the informer system in communist armies, enabling informers about racial matters to bypass the normal chain of command and shielding the informers from the necessity of identifying themselves and facing the persons they accuse. Concluding that the Gesell report is a vicious document deliberately intended to destroy the morale and the role of military men as defenders of the nation and to convert them into stormtroopers to compel civilian support for administration policies, the congressman demanded action. On September 17, 1963, Representative Carl Vinson, a liberal Georgia Democrat who in most matters supports the Kennedy administration, introduced a bill which would prevent implementation of the Gesell report and would make it a court-martial offense for any member of the armed forces to use the powers given them by the various McNamara directives. If public support for the Vinson bill is strong enough, it will pass. It is especially infuriating to recall that Kennedy and McNamara, now using the military as a club against the civilian population in connection with the most delicate and dangerous political issue of our time, muzzled the military with regard to criticizing communism, prohibiting military officers from making speeches telling the truth about communism, on the pretext that the military should not get involved in controversial matters. The drive to transform American armed forces into a centralized absolutism in defiance of the lessons of history and the combat experience of American fighting men began in 1943 during the Roosevelt administration. A major step in that direction was taken in 1947 when Congress authorized Truman to create the Department of Defense to speak with one voice for all the military services. In 1953 and 1958, Eisenhower took further steps toward monolithic unification and began shifting responsibility for military planning away from officers with combat experience, putting it in the hands of desk officers and civilians. Nonetheless, strong-willed military men with combat experience who understand the realities of war and the nature of the communist enemy were still in control of the military services when Kennedy became president and appointed Robert S. McNamara Secretary of Defense. Kennedy and McNamara have gradually squeezed such men out. Such men, for example, as Admiral George Anderson, Jr., removed as Chief of Naval Operations in the summer of 1963, allegedly because of his opposition to Defense Department policies and to the Test Ban Treaty. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who retired in August 1961, allegedly because of his strong anti-communist views and his opposition to defense policies of building conventional forces at the expense of genuine national defense with superior naval, air, and nuclear power. General Thomas D. White, who retired as Air Force Chief of Staff in July 1961, allegedly because he was critical of defense policies which would not permit the United States to develop a defense against missiles or to use her industrial potential to produce the kind of air power and weaponry that would give us unquestioned superiority over the Soviets. As genuine military men such as these were purged from high place, McNamara and Kennedy moved into policy-making positions the eggheads, men like Paul Nitze, Roswell Gilpatrick, and Charles Hitch of the Council on Foreign Relations, Alain Enthoven and Henry Rowan from the RAND Corporation, notorious for its book in 1958 on how American armed forces should surrender strategically, and worse than eggheads, men like Adam Yarmolinsky, the man who wrote McNamara's order to implement the Gesell report, a man who has a record of association with communist activities since his undergraduate days at Harvard. As General Thomas D. White puts it, the defense policies of the United States are now being formulated by pipe-smoking, tree-full-of-owls, professional intellectuals, overconfident, arrogant young professors, mathematicians, and other theorists who know nothing about the realities of war or military command and seem to know nothing about the communist enemy. In May 1963, after General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, had testified that he opposed a TFX fighter plane contract award to General Dynamics, but was overruled by civilian advisors, Kennedy announced that LeMay would be removed next year. In the summer of 1963, when the Senate was trying to get honest military testimony concerning the Test Ban Treaty, it was obvious that General LeMay had been told how to testify. Senator Goldwater maneuvered General LeMay into admitting that McNamara never talked to the Joint Chiefs of Staff about that treaty. LeMay conceded that he would be against the treaty if it had not already been negotiated. It is also reliably reported that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in secret testimony before a congressional body, opposed the Test Ban Treaty and enumerated its dangers to the United States. In public testimony, the same individuals took a different line. An influential segment of the public itself is also forced to support key administration policies such as foreign aid, foreign trade, racial integration, and appeasement of communism. This is achieved by economic pressures from the Defense Department and other big spending agencies, threats in local communities to cancel spending and remove installations, or promises of more spending and bigger installations. In short, forcing military men into controversial politics through implementation of the Gesell report, which was written by a group of left-wing racial agitators, is merely the most recent evidence that McNamara and Kennedy are transforming our armed forces into a military, political, economic pressure complex whose primary mission is not defense of the nation, but enforcement of the political programs of Washington officialdom. What can the public do? For the long run, study the voting records of representatives and senators to determine which ones show some understanding and respect for the Constitution. All who do not should be voted out of office. The Constitution places upon Congress the power and responsibility of providing national defense. A Congress composed of men with enough brains and integrity to uphold the Constitution would scrap our present no-win, no-defense policies and initiate a program infinitely less expensive than the present one, which would defend the United States against foreign enemies. Everyone who knows what is happening should make maximum effort to inform others so that there will be enough aroused and informed Americans to get a decent Congress and to support it in the performance of its proper duties. This is most important. Some of you will recall that this is the third broadcast on this general subject of mine. One was called Planned Dictatorship, one Reorganizing for Stalemate, and the present broadcast, McNamara's Commissars. Such detailed and documented information as is in these reports should be thoughtfully examined by millions of Americans. All who order copies of this broadcast will receive my suggestions about what you can do immediately and specifically, and something must be done. Goodbye. God bless you. For the full documented text of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot, Dallas 14, Texas, and ask for 424 McNamara's Commissars. 6 copies, $1.